Okay, I think we have a critical mass. So let's get started. I want to welcome everybody to today's presentation by the Urban Historical Society. It's all great to so this kind of warm, hot summer day. I hope you're inside, staying a little cooler, which is not easy to do. A couple of notes before we start, and I'll turn it over to Veronica at that point. First, we're recording today's session. We will, after today's session, we'll post the recording on the Urban Historical Society's website in the events section. Two, there'll be a question and answer session at the end. If you have questions and answers, please feel to put them in the chat as the talk goes on, or at the very end, you can put them in the chat and Professor O'Donnell will try to do his best to respond to them. So with that, I'd like to introduce Veronica Gederich, who is the president of the Urban Historical Society, who is going to introduce Professor O'Donnell. Thanks.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're delighted to welcome back Edward O'Donnell, Associate Professor and Chair of the History Department at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Professor O'Donnell is a professional historian, author, speaker, teacher, and podcaster. His publications and public presentations are extensive. Two of his books, Henry George and the Crisis of Inequality, and Ship Ablaze, The Tragedy of the Steamboat General Slocum, are terrific reads. As a professional speaker, he's delivered history-themed presentations before thousands of educational, business, and nonprofit organizations. During his years in New York City, he also led more than 1,200 walking tours through New York City's ethnic neighborhoods, such as Chinatown, Little Italy, and Harlem. Professor O'Donnell has contributed to programs on TV and radio stations, including PBS, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, and NPR. He has curated several major museum exhibits on American history and appeared in a number of historical documentaries. He was an advisor on the Irish apartment exhibit at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. In his public outreach, he's created video lecture courses on American history for the Teaching Company, including Turning Points in American History and America in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. I'd like to say while Professor O'Donnell's work covers a broad spectrum of historical and economic issues, the immigrant experience is often a part of that story. His work highlights the immigrants' strengths as well as their vulnerabilities, their successes as well as their tragedies. Professor O'Donnell, thank you so much for doing this program for us today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Great to come back for a second time. I'm just going to take a moment here to and thank you for the lovely introduction. It's always great to remember all the things you did, you know, when you give a talk. All right, so I'm going to yeah, there we go. There's my presentation. All right, now we're all queued up. So yeah, thank you all for turning out. I know it's both a beautiful day and kind of an oppressive day. So maybe staying indoors in air conditioning and listening to a talk on immigration is a better alternative than being at the beach. I don't know, but here we are, and thank you all for turning out. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about, begin my talk the way that I always do, and I think I did this with the previous one, which is to, just before we dive into the content, to think a little bit about what history is, like what are the kind of the key elements of history? Why do we study it other than for the entertainment value? And so one way to think about teaching or learning about history is thinking about it as the study of conflict. So, you know, and if we think about this, this of course involves warfare, involves revolutions and insurrections and riots, actual like physical conflict, but more often than not, especially in American history, it's conflict over ideas and arguing over and over and never ending an argument about everything. So you think about the founding period, you know, should the colonies break away from England and form their own republic? Or should women get the right to vote? Should we have universal health care? You know, these are the things that we have debated and are currently debating. Another thing that's really important about history is to think about not just the very famous people who have lots of power, but also the ordinary people. And that phrase agency, or that word agency, just simply means people exerting their will to change something or make something happen. And that can be done individually, or as we'll see today, by millions of immigrants, exerting their agency to get to America, and then also to make a new life in America, and by their efforts to change America. History is also, this is really important when people say, oh, history's so boring, we already know what happened. Say, actually, maybe we do, but also always remind yourself that people in the moment don't know they're living in history. They're just living their lives. And so they're making choices that shape history. So whether it's dropping the atomic bomb or imposing immigration restriction, as we'll talk about today, these are choices. Nothing in history is inevitable. In fact, my students know when I refer to the I word, I'm referring to the word inevitable as a no word in their papers or in our discussions, because nothing is inevitable. And then, of course, we always want to make sure that history speaks to not just, or it doesn't just tell us amazing stories and make us think about critical moments and that sort of thing. And but it's also about now. And there's a great quotation by James Baldwin who says, the real force of history is not that it's about the past, it's that it's about now, in our moment. We all carry history in us, and we are shaped and influenced by it every day of our lives. And so that's probably the biggest and most important thing about history, is that we need to be aware of how much we have in our heads and how much it's motivating and shaping our reactions to things. And also how much, right, the first cousin of history is nostalgia, how much history or nostalgia, which tends not to be terribly accurate. So we'll dive into that right now. So I always like, when I talk about immigration, to kind of frame it in this famous quotation by Oscar Handlin, one of the people who really pioneered the study of immigration as a legitimate historical subject. He's really the godfather of immigration history. And he famously wrote in his Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Uprooted, once I thought to write a history of American immigration, then I discovered that immigrants were American history. I mean, it's a bit of an overstatement in some regards, but it's also very important in kind of centering immigration as one of the core trends, core factors in American history. And immigration, of course, is one of those stories that is there from the very beginning of colonization, and it's happening literally at this very moment. Planes are landing at JFK in New York and elsewhere. So it's a continuum throughout our history. All right, so one thing to think about is, what do we think as a nation about immigration? Well, on the one hand, this may shock you all, but on the one hand, and this is an image from Ellis Island, a very beautiful, evocative image of faces of all different ethnicities and races and, immigrant groups composing also the American flag. And today in America, most Americans, the vast majority of Americans, love immigration. Now just hold that thought, because I know some of you may be literally scratching your heads, because we also know that Americans despise immigration. And so at this very moment, many Americans absolutely hate immigration, and they think it's destroying the country. And the weird part is that Americans, some of the same Americans, have these two thoughts in different parts of their brain. So there are millions and millions of Americans who love immigration and hate it at the same time in 2022. So we have to figure out, like, why do we think this way? What is it about this? How can we have two literally opposite positions on a single issue in our minds? Why do we love immigration? And this is a very evocative image from the early days of well, it's right after the Statue of Liberty is unveiled, and it's at the height of immigration, the kind of classic scene of people coming into New York Harbor and seeing the Statue of Liberty and equating their quest to live in America with liberty. By the way, and we can talk about this later, the Statue of Liberty has absolutely nothing to do with immigration, like literally zero. We turned the Statue of Liberty into an immigration symbol, but it has nothing to do with it in its origin. But we also hate immigration. So why do we have this sort of tension that why can't we reconcile, or why can't we figure out which one we think? And the reason is that there are two kinds of immigration, or at least in our imaginations, we imagine two kinds of immigration. So we imagine past immigration, and that's the part that everybody loves, right? Everybody in America loves past immigration because it's already happened. It involved their family members in most cases, and it seemed to work out just great. We are a nation of immigrants, right? But the other kind of immigration is that they're saying present day immigration. That's the one I hate. We love the earlier stuff. We love the Ellis Island chapters of American immigration history. We despise modern day immigration. And the kicker is that this is true not just in 2022. This is true literally every year of American history. People are making this same distinction between the immigration they see happening in the moment and the immigration of a previous generation or two, which they think was the good kind. So this divided view does indeed have a very long history. So let's just give you one example. So in the late 18th century, Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur was one of the first Europeans to observe America and write about it and send a series of pamphlets back to Europe describing this wondrous, fascinating new nation. And one of the things, as you can see in this quotation here, one of the things he focuses on is the multicultural nature of America, that it is unprecedented in his mind anyway, in terms of its multicultural character. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. So he's saying, not only is America diverse, it's that very diversity that'll make America dominate the world in the coming centuries. So it's a very upbeat understanding of the power of multicultural interaction. Not right in that same time period, just a few years earlier, a very familiar face, Benjamin Franklin, somebody we associate with tolerance and with inquiry and with just being a man of the Enlightenment. Yes, that's what he is, but he also in the 1750s went on a really long rant against German immigration to Pennsylvania. And so here's what he said, basically saying, why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we letting all these Germans in? Why should the Palatine Boers, Germans, be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Kind of an interesting point there. He's basically saying Germans have a different complexion from the English. Not sure whether he thought they were lighter or darker, but you get the idea here. He is ranting against the overwhelming numbers of Germans and the refusal to assimilate and the danger this poses to the state of the colony of Pennsylvania. So the question is, does this sound familiar? Well, if we just take Franklin's words from 270 something years ago, and we just change the six words that I'm identifying here, and we just change those 6 words, it sounds like something you could hear in an Uber or on at a coffee shop blasting on talk radio. Why should the Mexicans be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and culture to the exclusion of ours? Why should California, founded by the Americans, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Hispanicize us instead of our Americanizing them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? I mean, that's Franklin's words, with 6 of them changed up to reflect a different concern about a different ethnic group, and it sounds absolutely 2022. So that's one of the key takeaways, is just the interchangeability, the recyclability of these concerns about immigrants in the moment. It's a fascinating process, and I've got a million examples of these, but we only have about an hour, right? So let's put the pin in that one for a moment, and then talk about what is it that creates that two ideas about immigration notions. And one of it is, I mentioned nostalgia before, also myth. Myth and immigration, there's probably, it'd be interesting debate among historians whether the Civil War is our most mythologized chapter in American history or the history of immigration. Both are highly mythologized. I mean, both have severely misunderstood, which isn't just a tragedy from his understanding of history. The problem is it shapes our thoughts and our policies about immigration in 2022. All right, so one myth is that previous immigrants, note the key word there, previous immigrants, meaning the ones who came before today, came for freedom. It's a lovely idea, and there's the Statue of Liberty, which we all now know has nothing to do with immigration or immigrant freedom. But if we take a look at the record, we find, and this is a lot of numbers, I know, but this is just immigration from the 1870s through 1900, year by year flow of immigration. And the parts that are in red tell us something. So I love giving this out to my students because it looks like a sea of numbers. And I say, what do you see? And before long, they notice that immigration takes a nosedive in the 1870s, and it takes a nosedive in the 1890s, and then picks up right after that. And the reason is, we puzzle it out for a while, but the reason is that the United States went into 2 Great Depressions, almost as great as the Great Depression in the 1930s, in the 1870s and 1890s. And what do immigrants do? They stop coming. or they come in much, much smaller numbers. And this also doesn't show us the number of outflow, people that give up on America and head back to Germany and Ireland and Italy. And the point here is that immigrants come for freedom, yes, but be, as I say to my students, be more precise. Overwhelming number of immigrants don't come for the right to vote. It's a nice thing, but they come here to make more money. They come here to better themselves economically and the lives of their children. And there's no shame in that. People get very upset when you point this out, but it's just a fact, right? So when we see immigrants coming today, seeking jobs and building their lives and doing the things that they do, they're doing exactly what, you know, your great grandfather who came from Ireland did, or your great uncle did coming from Greece. All right, previous immigrants came legally. This is a lovely, you know, distinction that people try to use to kind of sort things out. Well, Ellis Island was established in the 1890s, not to create a beautiful museum for your family to visit, but to keep as many immigrants out as possible. It is a huge, like almost like a factory designed to screen out, you know, it's quality control. They're trying to screen out the unwanted, undesirable immigrants. What percentage of immigrants were sent back at Ellis Island after all these rigorous inspections that they were subjected to? 2%. That's it. America, there is no such thing, more or less. There technically is, but there's no enforcement. Immigration to America is wide, 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 wide open. So when you say my great grandfather came from, you know, France and in 1905 and he came legally, that's really not a big deal because it's literally impossible to come illegally for the great majority of people. And even if you got excluded, for example, if you're one of these 2%ers that were sent back, you could just book another trip, you know, come into Canada and then take a train to America. It's a wide, wide open border. So you don't get any extra points for your forebears coming, quote unquote, legally. Previous immigrants came in smaller numbers. This is another one that people are always convinced that current immigration is the greatest tidal wave of all time. And it's almost always untrue. So the greatest wave of immigration is not now in the last 30, 40 years. It was in the late 19th, early 20th century, 25 million people. And you can see in this, you know, some of these stats that I'll drop on you. New York City was almost 80% immigrant and children of immigrant in 1910. Chicago, same number. And you'd find this in Buffalo, New York. You'd find it, maybe not the same high percentage, but all across America, the impact of mass immigration is immense and more so than in our current times. And just to give you a comparison, we are close to that period. If you look at the bottom number there, but in 1910, 15% of Americans, 1 in 7, was born outside the United States. And today it's just a tick below it and may surpass it at some point. But all that's going to mean is it's a tie. It doesn't. So the point is immigration in previous eras was greater than it is right now. Previous immigrants came to stay, which implies that today's immigrants just want to come and, you know, fill their pockets and go home. Well, sorry, again, not true. If you look at these numbers, there are, you know, the numbers towards the top are smaller returns. So these are people that come to America and then leave and go back to their homeland. You get down to, you know, the Scandinavians, English, Japanese, and then towards the bottom there, Polish, Greek, and both halves of Italy, 50, in some cases, more than 50% of immigrants come to America not to stay. They are coming to here to work for a few years, pile up a little bit of money, and then, you know, go back and live better in their impoverished country. So certainly many immigrants came to stay, but in most cases, there's a huge number that don't want to do that. Another myth, previous immigrants assimilated quickly into American society. Not so, but it's a way of sort of, you know, when you hear people say, I went into Home Depot the other day and no one's speaking English. Well, had Home Depot existed in 1905, you would have had the exact same experience. Just think about two groups here, right? About in terms of assimilation. So Irish Catholics, my people, come in the vast numbers in the mid-19th century. And the policy of Irish Catholics and the Irish Catholic clergy was to utterly and completely reject one of the most important American institutions. In fact, some people said it's sort of the fourth pillar of the Republic. It is the public school. And Irish Catholics came to America and said, we like a lot of things here, but we see those schools as a network of Protestant indoctrination institutions that we are not going to send our kids to. And so they build a huge network of parochial schools to protect their children from American culture, American secular culture, American Protestantism. And just think about when people, have negative things to say about today's Muslim Americans, and they often will point to these religious schools that they've established, and as they're sending all their kids to these, the religious schools that are, teaching them Islam and Islamic culture and on. It's just exactly the same thing that Irish Catholics did on the grandest scale in the 19th and into the 20th century. As late as 1960, I think 1 in 5 Irish Catholics in America was going to a parochial school. I'll give you another example. Germans, they're the other big 19th century group. In 1917, there were 700 German language publications in the United States, 700. And the kicker is down at the bottom there. German immigration to America peaked 50 years earlier. So German Americans are, assimilating into American society, working, contributing, doing all the things, but they also want to keep their language. Every ethnic group does. And they're actually succeeding as late as 1917. It gets a little harder once we enter World War I. Previous immigrants behaved well. Well, maybe. Irish-born people in New York City in the 1850s they were 25% of the population. They accounted for 55% of arrests, 64% of poorhouse admissions, and pretty much every other negative social category you could think of. The Irish are overwhelming in those categories. So, and we could point to other groups as well, that it's the idea of people getting here, putting their bags down and getting to work and assimilating and obeying the law, et cetera, is simply a very convenient kind of oversimplification of the actual past. All right, let's jump from that kind of delving into mythologies that power and shape and warp our understanding of immigration. Let's now get into the big picture here. All right, so a quick overview of the major periods of immigration to the United States. So the first big one, and we're talking 19th century, there's clearly lots of immigration in the 17th and 18th century, but the big ones we associate with mass migration start in the 1820s. And that's, that first 40-year period. And we didn't call it at the time, we just called it immigration, but it's now referred to as old immigration. And it was about 8 million people, mostly coming from Northern and Western Europe. And the biggest groups were Irish, German, English, Scandinavian, and then a sidebar group not coming from Northern and Western Europe, but a very important one, the first significant migration of Chinese immigrants coming to the West Coast during the California gold rush. So that's the first big chunk. Starting in the 1880s, people begin to look around and notice that immigration is not only increasing in size, but also different people are coming. And that's why they start to refer to their period of immigration as new immigration and the previous one as old immigration. And so at roughly 1880 to 1924, much bigger number, notice from 8 million, now it's 25 million. And now they're coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. So still mostly European, but coming from a different part of Europe. And this is where, if your family is Italian, Jewish, Polish, Greek, et cetera, this is the period that they're most likely to have come in. Now, plenty of Irish are still coming in this period, plenty of Germans. In fact, my father's father came in 1896 from Ireland. So he was in this later period, but it's predominantly Southern and Eastern Europe. And then we enter a period of restriction. And we'll talk about nativism quite a bit in a moment, but nativists win the day in 1924, and we don't quite slam the gate shut, but we slam it, where there's like a brick in the doorway, holding the door just a little bit open, and that allows for a small number, 5 million, from the 20s into the 1960s. And the key thing here is these restrictions are 100% based on racist evaluations of immigrant groups. So they are basically looking at who wants to come to America and choosing certain groups that are desirable based on their racial characteristics, and certain groups that are undesirable, like Jews and Italians and Slavs. They are undesirable for their undesirable racial characteristics, as understood, and they're the ones who get almost no spots, no, very, very low quota number to come each year. We'll get into those details shortly. And then contemporary immigration. It doesn't really have a name, so I just call it contemporary immigration. Starting in 1965, because those laws were the quota system set up in the 20s was so explicitly racist, it's the middle of the civil rights movement in the 60s, and so Congress decides to scrap that old, outdated form of immigration restriction, open up an immigration a little bit more, and also set up a system where it's more equitable, more that every country in the world has a a more or less equal chance to send somebody to the United States. And that's the system. It really doesn't start sending lots of numbers of people until the 1970s, but 60 million people and counting. And again, not just a bigger number, but also different places. So now you see people coming from Asia, Africa, and Latin America as the greatest numbers coming in that time period. So a bunch of different time periods, different numbers, and different sources of people. But why do they come? Always worth pausing, right? We got to sweep aside the mythologies. We tried to do that, right? They didn't just come for freedom. They came for lots of things, right? So why migrate? One of the most important things to remember and to be aware of is the fact that immigration is not the normal thing to do. As Americans, we are conditioned to believe that it is the normal thing to do because almost everybody in this country has a connection to an immigration story. And so we think, yeah, when things go south in your home country, you get on a boat or you get on a jet and you come to America. But that's not true. Most people don't leave. And I'll give you the one example, which you can see in the image there, which is the Irish famine in the mid-19th century. It's a 5-year famine. 8 million people live in Ireland, so it's a heavily populated nation. When the famine strikes and mass starvation and disease run rampantly, 1.5 million people leave. So that means, do the math, 6.5 million people said, even though the food system has collapsed, disease is running rampant, people are literally dead on the side of the road, people are starving all across the country, let's just wait. Let's just stay here, let's stay and pray. And maybe this thing will pass, and maybe next year the potatoes will come back, or maybe next year the potatoes will come back. And it's easy to get to America in this period. In fact, some landlords want to get rid of you, and they're in Ireland, they're giving you free tickets. So like there's no barrier to leave, and yet most people stayed. And that's true almost any, you can imagine in a country that's just simply poor, right? Not experiencing warfare or famine, most people don't want to leave. They're just it's too scary a prospect. And as a consequence, for Ireland, just to finish the point, 1.2 million people died, the largest loss of life in a peacetime setting in the last 500 years of European history. So it's a pretty big cataclysm. Think speed ahead to the 1930s, right? For Jewish Germans living in the 1930s, many of them in this terrible rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime, many of them get caught and get stuck because they kept telling themselves naturally that it's too scary to migrate, and that maybe we just wait this thing out, and maybe Hitler's only saying he's going to do certain things and not going to carry them out. And so, you think most people, right, we are mostly conservative when it comes to the idea of uprooting and leaving to go somewhere. Yeah, Germany in the 1930s. All right, so why migrate? They're basically, immigration historians isolate certain ways to think about it. And the most simple way to think about it is things that are going poorly in your homeland, and then places that seem to have good prospects. So push factors, population boom in Europe after Napoleon's defeat in the early 1800s, Europe basically enters its longest period of peacetime. So there's less war, there's more greater crop yields, less disruption. And so therefore the population in Europe explodes. And so lots of people find themselves without jobs or with no prospects of inheriting a farm. And so they head for places like the United States. Industrialization is roaring into existence in the early 19th century. And some people do quite well by industrialization, but if you are, we'll just take one example. Why does Andrew Carnegie end up in Pittsburgh in the 1840s? He gets to Pittsburgh in the 1840s as a young kid because his dad was a weaver, living a very comfortable life as a skilled weaver and in a long succession of weavers in his family. And then come the 1830s, weaving is demolished by industrialized textile production. And so the Carnegies are out. I mean, they could have found something else, but they chose to uproot and come to the United States. There's, of course, plenty of religious and ethnic persecution that will send various groups to the US. And then there are disasters, like I mentioned, like the famine in Ireland or warfare. And then pull factors. If decide you want to leave your homeland, but where are you going to go? Certain places have an appeal. And one of them is, the United States becomes the #1 destination in the world. And because it's both industrializing at a rapid pace and it's expanding physically westward, acquiring more and more land. So take your pick. You want a farm? We're going to give you 160 acres of free land in this thing called the Homestead Act. Or you can, live in a city like Pittsburgh or New York City or what have you, and work in a factory and better yourself. So the number one reason, as we've gone over, some people are enthused about democracy and the prospect of self-government, but it's a much smaller number. And then certainly for people escaping ethnic and religious persecution, America's tolerance, imperfect tolerance, but much greater degree of tolerance for religious and ethnic minorities in this country than in many other parts of the world. So that's another reason to come to the U.S. And we see all this in immigrant letters, whether it's the 1600s or an email or a text in 2020 or 2022. Immigrants are often saying more or less the same thing about why your brother should come to America, why your sister should come to America, and they lay out these very same things. So where do immigrants settle in the United States? Again, we often have a kind of a simple view of this, which is that they settled in big cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and that's true. But most importantly here is to remind ourselves that immigrants went everywhere. And so when we think of the stories of the American West and this, the sweeping vista here in this Emanuel Lutze painting, in this, we don't see anybody ethnically identified, but if this is an accurate painting, it's probably half the group here are people that are not born in the United States. And so when you think of all the great Westerns, Western movies with Clint Eastwood and John Wayne and all that, they are just the whitest movies ever, and very inaccurate in terms of like portraying who actually were people going into the West. And you can see this in lots of evidence, but does they just focus on the poster on the right? California cornucopia of the world, room for millions of immigrants, right? So railroad companies and the same thing in the poster on the left. It's an ad from a railroad company in Nebraska trying to get Czech immigrants to come. And so they've printed a poster extolling the great opportunities to draw you from the East Coast into the American West. And I like to show this stat too. Minnesota in the 1880s was 30% foreign born, which is mostly German and Norwegian and Swedish, and that's the same percentage as Boston. So 1 in 3 people in Boston is born outside the United States. 1 in 3 people in the state of Minnesota in the same year is born outside. So much more of a Western story than we might actually imagine. And they're here. I can give you lots and lots of other stats about in this same late 19th century period, the percentages of people that were born outside the US are pretty staggering when we look at them. But they shouldn't be surprising, right? Because what are immigrants looking for? They are looking for economic opportunity, wherever it may exist. Okay, a quick little quiz. What's the most Irish city in America in 1900? Lots of good guesses, but I doubt any of you guessed Butte, Montana, because Butte, Montana was a mining town, and one of the earliest successful copper miners was from Kerry, County Kerry, Ireland. And when he achieved success, he ended up bringing or attracting thousands and thousands of, not just Irish immigrants, but Irish immigrants from County Kerry. And so Butte, Montana, as a percentage of the population, is the most Irish city in America in 1900, not Boston, not Philadelphia, not New York. Even Custer's army, Custer gets wiped out in 1876. 40% of the people who died in Custer's last stand were people born outside the United States. So we could go on this, but you get the picture. All right, now to the more familiar, the images of big American cities. This is the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and you can get an idea from the 1860s. Just how impactful this first great wave of immigration was. That New York City is less than half American-born white residents. It's a quarter Irish, 15% German, lots of other groups, and a small but growing African-American population. So that intense and almost in some ways sudden immigration impact is very evident in these numbers. And of course, what do immigrants do? They go to where there are other immigrants, and they have great communication networks, so they know where to go. And not surprisingly, this is when we start to see little Irelands, which you see the county, the ward distinctions there, 4, 5, and 6 in Lower Manhattan. That's the Little Ireland district. And then just a little bit north of it is the Little Germany district, full of Germans, or Kleindeutschland, as they would say, right? It's not exclusively Irish and German, but overwhelmingly so. And immigrants do this because this is where they can find other people that speak the language. And as you can see, this map of Little Germany from 1880, all those black dots correspond not surprisingly, to things that make people feel at home and connected, right? So churches, synagogues, beer halls, libraries, newspapers, all those things are in Little Germany, so that somebody who's made that bold move to come to America has friends, has a network, can get a job, can, find somebody to bail them out of jail, whatever it might be. You've got a kind of a network there, and that's where these institutions, these neighborhoods are formed, and then rapidly disintegrate over a period of a couple of decades. All right, and then the third destination is someplace, it gets a little closer to where many of you are right now, which is in upstate New York, but it's true everywhere. And so I know that part of the area in Irvington, East Irvington, was known as Dublin or Little Dublin. So I just picked out, and I also study Irish American history, and I know that there are 14 towns in America named Dublin. So it's from here to California, and there are probably dozens and dozens of other parts of towns or neighborhoods in the areas, that had an unofficial nickname, like Dublin in where many of you live, that is simply a name that was appended to it but didn't get any official status. So this indicates that in this case, Irish immigrants they go to Boston and New York and the big cities, but they also spread out all across the country, and they head up the Hudson River in search of opportunity. And so, yep, there's a map of where many of you are listening right now. So one of the things that draws immigrants not to go west or to go to big cities and so forth is opportunity in the form of infrastructure. So you could literally follow the flow of different immigrant groups along canals, and then along railroads, and then along big projects like the Transcontinental Railroad. But like this is the Croton Aqueduct that runs all the way up into eventually part of a much larger water system to bring fresh water to New York City. And that's built overwhelmingly with Irish labor. It's a monumental project, as you get from that image. But that also then brings people into those neighborhoods. And so some people will simply move on to the next big project, but there's always a core of people that stay behind and settle in those neighborhoods. We also know that your neck of the woods, just to complete the point, is also a place where a lot of the rich and famous of the Gilded Age ended up building beautiful, huge mansions. The building of those mansions was conducted primarily by immigrant labor, and then the staffing of those institutions, of those, if you've watched Downton Abbey, you know how many people it takes to run, basically a small castle. And many of those running, horses and operating a farm, working as servants and laundresses and all that, that's all going to be immigrant labor. So you have a compelling, it's a smaller part, but a significant part of the immigrant story. And Chet and Sarah sent me some documents from your neighborhood, and one of them was a great local history by Bob Connick, who I know was a member of your society. And it's a great read if you have a chance to do so, detailing family history, but also local history, but Irish immigrants who settled in that area. And some of them become farmers, but some of them also get jobs working as laborers or working as coachmen, which is you see in the image there. And most, especially for women, working as domestic servants. It's the number, 80% of America's domestic servants in 1890 are Irish immigrant women, and that'll be true well into the 1920s. I also note from the information that was sent to me that there was also a pretty significant, again, a second wave of immigration, and in this case, late 19th century, following the patterns we just talked about of Italian immigration. And there's a great history. I have to put my glasses on. Those of you of a certain age know what I'm talking about. But the Morabito family recorded, Fred Morabito gave an oral history, or he typed up his own history. And it's quite an amazing family story about starting in New York City, starting on the Lower East Side, and then eventually making their way to upstate New York. And same thing, getting involved in all manner of work, all manner, whether it's agricultural work or working for one of these wealthy families, doing farm labor. And also this triggers, we didn't get into it yet, but we will. This triggers as a document that came along when the first sort of significant number of Italian immigrant laborers were brought up to the Stearns farm. It elicited this, in an era of intense anti-immigrant sentiment, the 1890s, a warning sent to the family saying, you better remove these Italians because they are undesirable. We do not want them in our community, etc. So there's a lot of, there's in every case pushback. I don't have any, I'm sure that there's some documents from the earlier age when the Irish began to show up in big numbers, people resisting that and, trying to drive them out of town and so on. That would have been very, very characteristic. But wait, there's more. So we've been mostly talking about the mid-19th century migration. just to take a little bit of a trip into this later 19th century period, in early 20th century, the new immigration, the numbers, as we noted earlier, become larger, and they also are bringing people from different parts of the world. And just to give you an idea of the numbers, these are, unprecedented numbers. I mean, if you just look in the 1900 to 1909 period, that's the biggest decade in US history for immigration. In that 10 years, that's the total of immigration that came in the previous old immigration period. So, and what's happening here is it's technology. It's really easy to get to the United States now. It's become industrialized. You have industrial machines, steamships, that can get to America in about 10, 11 days. The tickets are cheap, and there's a whole railroad infrastructure and steamboat infrastructure in Europe, and there's also one in the US. So it's pretty easy to get to America, and there's insatiable demand for immigrant labor. And in this period, we talked about it's really, if your family comes from Italy or from the Russian Empire, your family is Jewish American, there's a very good chance that they came in this 40-something year period. And other groups coming from smaller but significant groups coming from Eastern Europe. I noted this earlier, but say it here, that Irish and German immigrants from the earlier period still keep coming in this period, but just in proportionally smaller numbers. And we also, just to sort of widen the lens a little bit, it's a different story, but it's a similar story, which is that African Americans become part of this great migration, or they embark on what's called the Great Migration, which is to leave the American South because of its extreme poverty, extreme racism, violence, and so forth, and come to American cities in the North for better opportunities. And so in many ways, it's the same kind of process, right? It's push factors and pull factors. You can't say it's the same thing because race is much more different than ethnicity, but it's an interesting parallel that's happening. The diversity of America is happening both internally as well as from the outside. Oh yeah, we already saw this. So we get a sense of the, sometimes I have my slides in a presentation, 2 or 3 different places, and I forget about them. But in any case, you get the idea. It's overwhelming, this percentage of foreign born in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then the stats on the Great Migration. 1.4 million come in the early part of the 20th century to northern cities. And the African American population in cities like Chicago and New York and Detroit, this is when they really become quite significant. The overall total is about 7 million. 7 million African Americans from the 1890s to the 1970s come to the North. So we know that from the beginning of our talk here that Americans love immigration and they hate it. Well, let's talk about the hate. What are the sources of the hate? Well, we know many people are familiar with the know-nothings. This was a political movement in the mid-19th century that sort of gave a brand name to nativism, but they are just simply one chapter of it. But they were very, very significant, and they actually became a very successful political party, almost became the successor party to the Whig Party when the Whig Party collapsed over the issue of slavery. So the know-nothings, that's their nickname. They're actually called the American Party. And the American Party eventually gets ousted or bested by the new Republican Party. But that gives you a sense of their power. So one of the most important things to think about in terms of immigration in nativism is that it's not just simply hatred of the foreigner. It has many, many manifestations, right? Many types. One of them is religious. The great fear. Oh, this is number one by far. What people are worried about when it comes to immigration in the 19th century is Catholicism. They are absolutely convinced that the Pope's top priority is to destroy Republican government, to destroy, a free-thinking, enlightened Republican form of government. And they don't see lots of Catholic immigrants coming to America as just an interesting factor. They see it as a conspiracy, where the Pope is actually sending these people to America, and at a moment's notice, he will, sound the alarm, and the Catholics will rise up and overthrow the Republic. This image shows the Pope leering at America and popery undermining free schools. And you notice the author there is Edward Beecher. He is the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe. So she's writing about the evils of slavery. He's warning Americans about the evils of Catholicism. And there's a ton of info on this. I could show you many of these things. And believe me, my Catholic college students who I teach at Holy Cross, they are often kind of stunned by how really negatively the Catholicism was understood to be. And here's Samuel F.B. Morse, whose name may ring a bell as the telegraph inventor. The Catholic conspirators, so he writes a best-selling pamphlet called The Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, And he says the Catholic conspirators against our liberties who have been admitted from abroad are now organized in every part of the country. They are already the most powerful and dangerous sect in the country. It is liberty itself that is in danger. We must defend ourselves from this subtle attack. So he's saying they're coming to get us. Wake up, people. All right, this leads to violence. There's a tremendous number of violent incidents in the mid-19th century. And the biggest one was the Bible riots in Philadelphia, Protestant Americans versus Irish Catholics. 3 churches are burned, 20 people are killed in these midsummer riots. So it's not just words, it's actual violence. And just to, as I did it previously, kind of jump to the present, the very same things that people are saying about Muslim immigrants and their allegedly sinister plans to overtake America and overthrow democracy, et cetera, are the exact same thing, almost word for word, what were said about the Catholic conspiracy, the so-called Catholic conspiracy to take over America in the name of the Pope. All right, people are worried also about poverty because we've told ourselves in America that we don't have poor people, or we have very few poor people compared to Europe. Why would we import, poverty and make us look a lot more like Dickensian London, right? We don't want that. We are stamped against that. So keep poverty down by keeping immigrants out. That's the simple formula. Yeah, and you get a sense of, here are immigrants scrounging on a garbage barge that's about to head out to sea. This looks like a very un-American scene to a lot of people, and a very Dickensian scene. In modern times, it looks like a scene we'd see outside of a Rio de Janeiro or some other large non-US city. And so it's quite alarming. So people do that simple idea like, well, if we don't want this kind of poverty, let's restrict immigration. Nativism and crime, always been associated, sometimes accurately, most times wildly exaggerated. I love this quotation because it's so blunt. And he's talking about the Irish in this case. There's a large class, I was about to say, a majority of the population of New York and Brooklyn, to whom the rearing of 2 or more children means inevitably a boy for the penitentiary and a girl for the brothel. Well, tell us what you really think, Judge. But let's see, about 30 years later, a similar statement, but this case against Jewish immigrants, saying basically, as you can see in the quotation there, that Jewish immigrants account for the great majority of crimes in New York City. I mean, it's statistically not true, but it's reflective of the kind of nativist hatred for this at that point, new group. Blaming immigrants for stealing jobs, right? You can see in the poster here, shall American labor be protected against foreign competition and the ruin of, in our labor market, saying that immigrants are actually stealing jobs or they're pulling down our wages because they'll work for less. This is not a new claim, believe me. And I love this. This is a great, nothing like late 19th century political cartoons. And you can see the vagabond immigrant who's literally just stepped off the boat, reaching into the sturdy workingman's home and stealing his bread, literally stealing his bread and his butter. Every time there's an outbreak of disease, cholera, diphtheria, typhoid, etc., in the 19th century, it tends to explode in big cities and often explodes in the neighborhoods of the poorest people, which is immigrants. And certainly any big outbreak of cholera was associated with the Irish, and again led to people saying, you don't want cholera, restrict immigration. There's also the fear of takeover, right? This idea that there's just so many immigrants coming, they're literally going to just devour us. And in this case, you can see the image. The Chinese immigrant on the right and the Irish immigrant on the left are literally devouring Uncle Sam between the two of them, indicating the kind of notion that we're not going to be able to recognize our country before long. And you can see why they're saying this. They're not, I mean, it doesn't justify nativism, but we can see where their feelings are coming from. New York City has 45,000 Irish in 1840, which is a lot. It has over 200,000 by 1860, so just 15 years later, or just 20 years later. So it's a pretty radical jump, and that's just the Irish. And also politics. I mean, part of that takeover fear is that they're seeing that democracy, lets everybody who's a citizen vote. And if you can get your citizenship quickly, which was pretty easy to do in 19th century America, suddenly the vote can be seriously influenced by the immigrants. Here's an angry Bostonian saying, I know this is in New York City, sorry. We in this city have got to submit to be ruled by the dregs and outcasts of Ireland. Men who know not a letter of the alphabet, who have been in this country 1 month or 6 days, decide who shall represent us in Congress. So And so we see this very similar statements today about, and justifications for voting restriction laws and things are all predicated on sort of the people that are deemed by the people that push those laws illegitimate voters. Nativism and radicalism. So in the late 19th century, you have a record number of strikes. We have the growth and popularity of socialism and communism and anarchism, and people saying the only reason we have these things is not because workers are being exploited, it's because we have these immigrants who are bringing all these dangerous ideas. So want to stop the dangerous ideas and stop the strikes, put up a wall, or stop immigration. So that's a lot of dimensions to nativism. And did we leave anything out? Yes, we did. What about nativism and terrorism? Here's one of my many 11th commandments of history, which is that nothing is new, right? So we think immigration and terrorism that's a last 30 years, last 20 years concern. Nope. In the first group identified as a terrorist problem in America were Irish nationalists who came to America, and this is a guy who was very, I guess, infamous. But the first immigrant group in America that raised money for terroristic purposes, that bought dynamite and built bombs, and then went across to England. Now, the difference is they're blowing up England, they're not blowing up America, but they blew up the first bombing campaign, which we got used to in the 1970s in Northern Ireland. The first version of that is in the 1880s, carried out by Irish money and Irish American money and Irish American nationalists, blowing up British buildings, blowing up British policemen, and so forth in the early 1880s. So immigration and terrorism is not new. And you can see here's a Lady Liberty stopping the dregs of Europe, and in this case, the guy on the lower right is that Irish dynamiter. It literally says on his bag, a dynamiter. All right, I know we're pushing time here because we're having so much fun. So I'll kind of go through this period, but basically nativism, as I noted way back at the beginning, nativism wins the day. Nativist organizations, we mentioned the Know Nothings. Well, the APA is founded in the late 19th century, mostly anti-Catholic, but also pretty much anti-foreigner as well. The Immigration Restriction League is founded in the 1890s, and they're the ones that popularized the idea of a literacy test to say that'll keep out a large chunk of immigrants. Early forms of restriction, legal restriction, begin to appear in the late 19th century, first excluding the Chinese, then excluding anybody who's brought to America on a labor contract. That's made illegal. The Federal Immigration Act is passed in 1890, and that's what brings us Ellis Island. It also, and all of those categories of exclusion, all those tests at Ellis Island are basically trying to determine one of four things: your health, your poverty, are you a criminal, or are you an anarchist? And these are familiar scenes from Ellis Island. It's the great filter, as we mentioned earlier, something that is designed to keep out the dregs, the unwanted people. The early 20th century is also a time of the rebirth of the KKK, which not only hates Black people and not only is in the South, but it's also all across America, in the North, and it is also adding to its list of targets Catholics and Jews. And it becomes so popular that there are 5 million members by the mid-1920s. And so they are a major political force in American life, and they are pushing for immigration restriction. Some of the motivation also comes from a parallel movement, which is the eugenics movement, a pseudoscience movement that said we can determine the more racially fit people from the racially inferior people, and that we could figure out who the inferior people are, we could keep them out of the country. And that in the country, in the United States, this also leads to forced sterilization of women from undesirable categories. So women that are mentally ill, women that are non-white, women that are immigrants, tens of thousands of forced sterilizations based on eugenics ideas into the 1970s in the United States, but also for our purposes here, a major force for restricting immigration. So in 1924, we passed the first, well, not the first, but the big immigration restriction quota law, the Johnson-Reed Act. And you can see the popularity of this position, and people, pretty thrilled with the idea of sending these dangerous people back. The impact was, I don't want to bury you in this, but basically it created the quota system that favored people from Northern and Western Europe. And it also set the overall total as 156,000. So in a time when 1 million were coming a year, it radically shrinks down the numbers and then says, of those numbers, really only people from Northern and Western Europe, no more, not nearly the same numbers from those other areas. And you can see here, Russia, which is mostly almost exclusively Jewish immigration, Russia is sending 34,000 a year. They get a quota of 2,200. Poland, 51,000 a year. They get a quota of 6,000. So it's very explicitly aimed at particular favored groups and excluding non-favored groups. We talked about it earlier. We end that in 1965 with the passage of a new, more equitable law that has been amended many times over, and so now it's a bit of a mess and probably does need to be revisited. But you get a sense of the numbers, and it's really they're pretty significant numbers, and they're comparable in many ways to the peak years of the 1890s through the 1920s. And part of that migration is undocumented immigration. So each era has different people coming from different places, and so one of the sources of immigration is the border, but it's actually not the main source. Most Americans have ideas of hordes of people pouring over the border, and that's really where our immigration numbers are coming from. It's actually a much smaller number. Most people don't even cross the border. Of the undocumented immigrants, there are 11 million in the United States. The vast majority of them landed at an airport. They landed at an airport and overstayed their work visa, overstayed their travel visa, overstayed their student visa. That's the great hole in the border. It's at our airports. It's not at the southern border, which has now become the most militarized border, and in some ways one of the most militarized borders in the world. And we see in our times a reboot of the very same kind of nativism that we were just talking about in some detail, changing some of the terms, changing some of the claims and all, but basically the same set of things that have been motivating fear. And the problem here is that it's perfectly legitimate to have a debate about immigration, and we do need to think about what's the right number and how we choose people that can come here. All of those things are valid questions, but you can't have that debate when people have their heads so crammed full of misinformation and mythology and nostalgia and false claims about previous generations of immigrants. It's not possible, because it's like people are talking two different languages. So I think we need to learn, like a lot of things, we need to kind of relearn our history in this particular category as a way to come to terms with what would be a more equitable and more just and more reasonable immigration policy moving forward. And we can see that despite all the problems, the process of people wanting to come here still continues. These are always wonderful photos of people being naturalized at a ceremony. And that slide means I must have hit the end of my slide rack. So I want to thank you all very much. I know I went a little bit longer. The last 45 minutes before I started this talk, I was actually deleting slides. So my tendency is to talk a lot about my slides. So anyway, I'm going to unshare my screen. All right, and turn things back over to Chet, I think. Oh, I think
Yes, no, it was me. I apologize. Ed, thanks you so much. It's always so fascinating to hear and look at the history in the light of the cacophony you hear about today. It's just like, it's just so heightened and whatever. And remember that this has got a long history in this country, and it's so fascinating. I really like your point about the fact that everybody loves old immigration. It's the current immigration that everyone hates. So we're going to ask it for folks who have questions, please put them in the chat. But I want to start off with something. One of the things that, and this is probably a fairly new phenomenon, I'm not sure this is something which you focused on, but there's a lot of discussion about asylum as another element of how people are restricted or not. And and so that's something that came out of after World War II, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Formal asylum law, yes. I mean, we've had we've opened our doors, in the mid 19th century to, German democracy advocates, fleeing persecution and coming to the U.S. But the formal process of asylum starts after World War II.
And so so that's always, even though there's the formal process, has that always been part of our immigration or our legal structure for people to come in here and say that I'm fleeing persecution from overseas?
Well, it didn't matter up until after World War II. So in World War II, it sort of creates we basically, it's kind of a Cold War policy. So huge numbers of people fleeing communist East Europe and so forth, and then parts of Asia. So we set up a system where we can kind of favor people fleeing communist takeover. That's one of the major things. So in previous generations at Ellis Island, they would ask you all kinds of questions about how much money do you have? Do you have a job waiting for you? Where are you going to settle? Are you a communist? They would ask you all these, and then open your mouth and let me look at your tonsils. But they wouldn't, and if the immigrant said, yes, but I'm fleeing, a tyrannical Russian government, that might make people sympathetic, but that would have no bearing on the actual procedure. It's really, those 4 categories of exclusion. And if you don't hit any of them, then you're welcome to come on in.
So here's a question. I think you talked a little bit about, the question is, how will this re-education happen? I think you mentioned re-education, how will people rethink or evolve their thinking about immigration? Any thoughts on that?
Well, people always say, what are the lessons of history? And I always say, well, there's only one lesson of history, which is that nobody ever pays attention to the lessons of history or historians, right? They listen to us and they read our books and stuff, but they, like the most important things, just sort of fly over their heads. So the great model and the great problem we see in this is trying to re-educate ourselves on the history of slavery and race in American history, right? And so it's a parallel thing. And so out of the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter and so forth, there's been this wide recognition that we have done a really terrible job of teaching about slavery, about racism, and about white supremacy and so forth as a major feature in American history. Terrible feature. We wish it wasn't true, but we have to confront it. And since that time, what has happened? There's been a major pushback about people saying, well, no, you can't tell the negative story parts of American history. That's un-American, that's unpatriotic to emphasize slavery or to talk about racism and so forth. So I think on the one hand, the good part of that story is that there was this huge recognition that we needed to rethink and really restructure and emphasize the way we talk about slavery and race and racism. We could do that. We should do that about immigration, but it's going to face, a similar, and it already, any attempt to do it is going to face a major pushback.
So here's another question. In the current political climate, how true is it that we are a multicultural society?
I missed that.
In the current political climate, how true is it that we are a multicultural society from your perspective?
Well, we are a multicultural society. I hesitate to say undeniable, but if you look at any kind of category, if you just looked at our American demography, who are Americans, we are an astonishingly diverse society. Even if you just, even if you were to just simply take like Hispanic Americans, right, Latino Americans, that is such a ridiculous phrase in a way, because within that large category are people from 30 different countries, speaking all kinds of different dialects and with different histories and all, but we kind of lump them together. So we not only have huge numbers of people from Latin America, but we have people, they themselves are incredibly diverse. And if you look at America's, just look at what Americans eat. There was a time, America, that spaghetti was ethnic food, like it was really exotic food, and you went to, you could, if you read, letters of hippies and bohemians, I should say, in the early 20th century, living in Greenwich Village, they talk about like, yeah, we went down to Little Italy, we had spaghetti, like it was this amazing safari, into the dark, streets of New York to have this amazing, exotic, strange food. Of course, that's just American food now, along with pizza and burritos and everything else. So we are an incredibly diverse society, but we are also a society that has shared values and shared political culture and so forth. And there's a big reaction against diversity and a big pushback against in the same way that Benjamin Franklin said, people trying to cling to their ethnicity. It's always been a tension to say we're a nation of immigrants, and can I be American and Irish American at the same time? Can I be Jewish American, or do I have to just be American? I think it's always one of the prices that we pay for the kind of diversity that we have. It is an incredible source of strength, whether it's just our, again, our the kind of food we have. But if you look at, the most successful startup companies in the last 30 years in America, huge percentage of them are founded by people born outside the United States or are the children of people who came as immigrants to America. So it's a major feature, but it is also something that can be weaponized, and so immigration is a very weaponizable topic. People, I think we are, people that study, what's the term, biogenetics or something, where they're studying like why we have, where we're, and biogeneticists don't like the term, we're hardwired, but to use the slang term, we are in some ways hardwired to be kind of tribal and to be kind of anxious about the outsider. And so that's what nativists are doing, is they're pushing that button. Sometimes they're doing it because they really believe it, but most cases, it's people doing it for political gain. They know that there's very few topics in American history that you can raise, the idea of invasion, the idea of somebody threatening American institutions and values, this other coming from outside. That is an easy go-to. The history of American politics is full of those examples. And so we're in that moment now where some politicians have realized that weaponizing this issue of immigration is awesome for terrifying people, enraging people, and then getting them to vote for you.
So here's a question. Is the immigration rates in the last couple of years up dramatically from what they've been before? Or has it just been more, as you say, weaponized by people as more of an issue?
Yeah, so immigration, we saw the 19th century chart. If you look what happened in 2008, immigration nosedives into America, and there's also a huge number of immigrants that leave America, go back to their homeland because of the hard economic times. So immigration right now is about 1 million a year. Could be a little bit more, a little bit less. It depends on the year, which is not terribly much larger than it was, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And we are, of course, a larger country. So 1 million a year in 1910, when we had something like 110 million people in this country, that's a heck of a lot of immigrants. 1 million a year in a country now that has 330 million people living in it is really not that much. And if you haven't noticed, we have a massive demand for labor in this country. So, we could talk easily for an hour on the economic impact of immigrants coming to this country, but there's a real hunger. Also, the aging of this country. If you look at many European countries that have very low rates of immigration, we occasionally hear that our social security system is going to run out of money, and by the year 2040 or what have you. There are European countries where their social systems are going to run out of money or become seriously strapped in like 5 years, because they have a birth rate that is below replacement. They have 0.8 children per couple, and so societies that allow immigration stay younger and stay more economically vibrant. Along with that, of course, comes the challenge of being a multicultural society.
So another question, historically, what has been the part played by religious leaders in creating tensions around immigration?
Well, I mean, again, a lot of these things correlate with certain religious groups. I mean, I go to a church nearby that is this tiny little UCC church that 10 years ago, the pastor, a woman named Pastor Judy Hanlon, a friend came to her and said, well, we have this guy from Jamaica. He's gay. He suffered tremendous persecution. And he's basically homeless in America. And the homophobia in Jamaica is really beyond belief, and it's spread mainly by religious leaders. So she took this guy in, the parish kind of adopted him. And next thing you know, they've got this full-blown program now where people coming seeking asylum from all around the world, lots from Jamaica, lots from Uganda, lots from Central America, from Eastern Europe, are coming to and finding this little church that is taking them in. We give them $500 a month, we give them free housing, and we hook them up with lawyers so that they can get their case, because they're all LGBT folk from countries where to be that, it means you're in danger not just of persecution but of death. And so, so you can't really say one thing or the other about religious leaders. In this case, it's a religious leader that's really doing a lot of amazing social justice work on behalf of immigrants. But you also have many others that are, giving voice to this idea that our quote unquote our country is being taken from us by them. And also you have many religious leaders, probably the majority, as Martin Luther King would point out, saying absolutely nothing nothing on this issue, in the same way that most religious leaders are saying, to his anger and frustration, nothing about civil rights and racism in the 1960s. And you go back, whoops, you go back to the, I'm getting excited there with my gesticulations. And but you go back to the 1840s and read Frederick Douglass. What is he saying? He's saying, you know, all these in this so-called Christian society, not a word from the, you know, the pulpits in the North about slavery, and plenty of words from the pulpits in the South about why slavery is totally cool and is completely compatible with Christianity. So I know that's a long meandering answer, but I think I think religious leaders are on all, there's some that are feeding the flames of a resentment and xenophobia. There are others that are trying to stop that and trying to care for the people that are kind of caught in that circumstance. And then there's a lot that are just sitting it out.
So I think we've been going for a little bit. I think we probably have to call, and I want to thank everybody for the thoughtful questions they give. But if I could ask Veronica to come back on, I think she's got a few words of just thanks and for everybody. So Veronica, why don't you take it away?
You said it, Chet, and Professor O'Donnell, that was wonderful. I can't tell you, how great that was, and it's given us all a great deal to think about.